Well, the Global Climate Change Conference, COP28, is kicking off in Dubai. It's a gathering to hammer out worldwide agreement on decreasing our dependence on fossil fuels and keeping global warming below certain temperatures. Helping poorer countries transition to cleaner and greener sources of energy is a key element and of critical importance to us in South Africa. So too is the issue of loss and damage. That's the acknowledgement that while richer countries have polluted the atmosphere through extreme use of oil and coal, many developing countries are facing the worst impact of global warming, and they are least equipped to mitigate that impact. Let's speak now to Tshepo Ntsane. He's part of the Sustainable Finance and ESG Advisory at Rand Merchant Bank. Tshepo, thank you so much for joining us. So you advise around environmental, social, governance matters. Let's jump into what's going to be happening at this conference, but perhaps take a step back and start in September when African leaders gathered in Kenya, and out of that came the Nairobi Declaration. What was that declaration about, and what does that mean going into COP28 now?
Thank you, Sally. I think what was exciting about the Kenya Climate Summit that happened in September is like for the first time African leaders came together and say, instead of going as individuals to summits such as COP, let's go together as a united front, as a unified voice to say, this is what Africa is positioning, these are our plans, and this is our intention to address climate change. And actually they put forward very good plans out around financing, around opportunities to invest, but also around economic development, around participation of the youth, participation of women, vulnerable communities. But it was actually a good plan, and it's actually positioned the continent well to say this is what they'll be putting forward at COP28, and their negotiation position will be based on that.
Right, and how does it differ? You know, is every country that was part of that Nairobi Declaration, are they all on the same page?
So what is exciting is the fact that it was endorsed by African leaders who attended that climate summit. And if you look at it, it's almost a position of saying Africa is open and is willing to embrace this climate change, rather than playing victim to say we only contribute 3%, but as a continent we're saying is we're willing to embrace this climate change, and this is our position going forward.
And not being dictated to. Because I think one of the criticisms is everyone's being told, oh, you have to transition, and it's important to transition to greener forms of energy. Lots of pledges coming from developed countries, but we haven't seen a lot of change on the ground, and a lot of those pledges have not actually materialized. Am I right?
So that is correct, because especially if you look at the Copenhagen COP, there was COP21, where there was commitment made by developed countries where they said they will mobilize about $100 billion per annum to developing countries so that they can address climate change. But what we have not seen is those commitments coming to fruition. We have seen some cash flows, but what is positive is that every year we're seeing that number go up. The last number I looked at, I think it was around 2021, it was around $90 billion. So that's what we've seen. However, though, what is different about this COP, I mean, the president of COP28 mentioned the fact that this COP will be different. And having followed COP for quite some time, what is exciting about this COP is there was an agreement around the loss and damage fund, which was supported by the parties today. But what is exciting is that 20 minutes after that, almost 400 billion worth of commitments were made. That is actually quite new, because if you look at this fund was established in COP27 last year, but now we're into COP28. Even before setting targets, there's already commitments. I think we're starting to see some form of acknowledgement by developed countries that if they don't support developing countries, this transition that we're looking at might not happen, and we might not reach the 1.5 degree temperature target that we are all aiming for.
Yeah, so it's that's exactly right. A sense of real energy coming from COP28 already, and so often these conferences end with quibbles over the inclusion of a word or not in a certain paragraph. So there's a sense of action. They're saying this fund is now operational, but the nuts and bolts still have to be sorted out. What is Africa's position and South Africa's position on this loss and damage fund? And are these loans, or is this money that will be actually given to pay back, really, for the impact of climate change? So
that actually became like a very big point of contention, especially it was a worry pre-COP to say, will the loss and damage fund actually be operationalized? Because the last meeting in October, there wasn't an agreement, but fortunately there was an agreement now. And even around the operationalization, it was the issue around where does the fund reside? Where do the money sit? But what was good is that for the first 4 years, the money will sit with the World Bank. And then immediately there was a point of, but wouldn't that make it challenging for developing countries to access? And in what format will that funding be? So there's a whole lot of work that still needs to be done to say that money cannot only be loans. There needs to be some concessional funding, there needs to be grant funding as well. And so that it's almost like a blended model rather than putting African countries in more debt. So a lot of that is being negotiated.
If we look at the transition to greener energy here in South Africa, I mean, we are in an electricity crisis. We've had to hang on to our older coal-fired power stations, otherwise we just probably would have a collapsed grid. It's not ideal, but it's the way it is. I'm wondering if that's a sentiment that's echoed across Africa, if other African countries have the same concern about how easy or difficult it's going to be to really transition to green energy when we have quite a lot of old technology that's still serving us.
Yeah, so that's actually quite a big debate coming from Africa to say, one, we are not that developed. There's a lot of people that don't even have access to electricity, let alone load shedding. And the continent is not yet electrified. So the African leaders and the continent is asking, let us first have energy. Let us first develop before we can transition. And therefore, they're talking around, let us peak our emissions and then plateau and then decline. But I think an opportunity that comes with that is because we don't have a lot of these old fossil fuel-based assets, we can actually have an opportunity to leapfrog, to say we don't have to adopt some of these assets that in the future might be stranded. And you're also seeing a lot of these fossil fuel assets, you struggle to find funding. But to the extent you're starting to look at these low carbon technologies, you can attract different pools of capital. And also, even these climate funds, you can say, okay, instead of giving me a loan, come and invest and own the asset and provide us electricity or provide us energy.
Yeah, it was interesting just this week, the British investment company put down a lot of money to be involved in 2 wind farms, one in the Eastern Cape, one in the Northern Cape. And that's the sort of investment that we need, not only for our electricity supply, but also to create jobs. Jobs is one of the big contentious issues. A lot of people are still employed in the old, dirty energy business. They can't be left without a job.
Correct.
Is there enough happening to transition people into these new technologies and transition people out of old jobs into those new jobs?
So you are seeing pockets of those conversations happening, both at corporate level, but also on a national level. I mean, with the issuance of the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan and even the implementation plan, whereby skills development is one of the key elements of that, to say how do we upskill, cross-skill, and ensure that those who would be vulnerable to this transition, particularly the Mpumalanga province, as to how do we ensure that those communities are not left behind as we transition, and ensure that even the employees and every other secondary value chain across or around the coal industry is not left behind as we transition, because what we cannot have is a situation where we transition but a whole lot of people don't have jobs. That is why that conversation is happening, and I think, yes, it's a bit slow right now, but you're starting to see pockets of green shoots coming along.
All right, well, there's going to be a lot to look at and watch in the coming days. But as you say, COP28 has got off to a very active start, which let's hope it marks a real change in the way things have been done in the past. And thank you very much for joining us in studio. Much appreciated. Thank you. That, of course, is Tshepo Ntsane. He's part of the Sustainable Finance and ESG Advisory at Rand Merchant Bank. Now, staying with climate, the South African Weather Service is warning of above normal temperatures during